Hi everyone, welcome to Speakeasy JS, the JavaScript meetup for mad science, hacking, and experiments. I'm Faraz, and I'll be your host this evening. Mad science is about doing things for no other reason than because you can, building things that make other people say, whoa, I didn't know that was possible. So today we're joined by Simon Willison, who's going to be speaking to us about how SQL in your client-side JavaScript is a great idea. And I'm really curious to hear all about that. So Simon is the creator of an open source project called Dataset, which is a tool for exploring and publishing data. He's also co-creator of Django, that web framework from way back 15 years ago that is a powerhouse of an open source project. And he's also a fellow at the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowship at Stanford. And with that, you can go ahead and take it away. I'm really eager to hear all about SQL on my client side.
Fantastic. So yeah, I'm Simon, and SQL in my SQL in my JavaScript is something which I started literally as a joke to troll my coworkers a few years ago. And to my surprise, none of the obvious reasons that it's a bad idea turned out to be bad ideas. So I've slowly started coming around to the idea that actually this is a really powerful tool to have in your tool chest. So I'll get to that in a moment. I need to introduce the project that powers this mad science first. This is Dataset. Dataset is a project I've been working on for the past 3 years, and it's a tool for exploring and publishing data, which, I mean, pretty much anything could be called that. So I find the best way to show you what it is to start with the demo. This is my dog, Cleo. Cleo is a San Francisco dog. So obviously she has a Twitter account and she tweets about things. And whenever I go anywhere with Cleo, I check in on Swarm. I still use Foursquare Swarm, and I check into places. And if Cleo is with me, I check in with the wolf emoji in my check-in message. So this right here is Dataset. It's got a table of data that I extracted from the Foursquare API with all of my check-ins. And because these check-ins have a latitude and longitude on them, Dataset can display a map. So this is a map of all of the places that I've been, which looks like I'm quite well traveled. But if we knock that down to just the places where created starts with 2021, I think that's this year has not been quite so exciting. I've made it around a little bit of the Bay Area. But what's more fun is because this is all running on a SQL database and we can do queries, I can say, show me everything where the shout includes, that's a like query, where the shout contains that wolf emoji. Oh, I think I need to get rid of the white space around that as well. And this will give me a map of Cleo's check-ins. So this is Cleo's world. This is essentially the places that Cleo likes to go. If I'm curious about the types of places, I can use faceting. So I can say, show me, for venue categories, facet by this. Show me a count of venue categories that she likes to go to. She's a dog, so she likes parks and dog runs, but she also likes coffee shops and bakeries. Let's have a look at bakeries and see if we can figure out which her favorite bakery is. And so here we go, bakeries. I'm going to change venue name, facet by this, and we can see that she's quite a fan of Hardo, which is a German bakery near us, but she also likes going to Arsecolt Bakery. So this is essentially software for figuring out your dog's favorite bakery, which is clearly a killer app just on its own. But the key thing to understand about this is running on top of a Sqlite database. I'm using Sqlite because it's incredibly quick and cheap and inexpensive, and basically, I can run the software almost for free. And if I click View and Edit SQL, I can see the SQL query that shows me my dog's favorite baker is. And I can edit that SQL. So I can say, you know what, I just want the venue name and the latitude and the longitude where shout like wolf. Oh, I made an error in my SQL somewhere. It's a trailing comma. It's always trailing commas. So now I'm running custom SQL with emojis in it, which is super cool, to get back bakeries that my dog has been to. And if I click on JSON, if you look at the URL up here, clicking on JSON adds a .json extension, and now I've got a JSON feed of bakeries that my dog has been to. So now things are getting interesting, and you'll note that $SQL there is showing me the SQL. That's the SQL query that I just typed in. So this is an API that lets me run a SQL query and get back the results in JSON. I should note that this feels incredibly dangerous because SQL injection is the most common security flaw on the internet, and I'm using that as a feature. There are a few reasons it's not dangerous. Firstly, in the public versions of this, all of the data is meant to be public. You don't put anything in the system that you wouldn't want somebody to be able to see. Secondly, it's all done in read-only mode. And I'm opening the SQL database in read-only mode such that even if you tried to do an update or a delete or an insert, it wouldn't work. And thirdly, I've got a time limit on this. So if you try and do a really expensive SQL query, after a second, it'll time out with an error. I'll show you another demo, again, with Clio. So I've got a database of all of Clio's tweets, 1,219 tweets that she's done. And this is a custom SQL query that does a little bit of a join. It joins against the media tweets table, and it pulls out the URL, and it shows me photographs. So I can see basically this is a feed of Clio's selfies. And every time Clio goes to the vet, she tweets her weight. She tweets, I weigh 49.7 pounds. I weigh 52.8 pounds. So I've got I can run regular expressions as part of my SQL queries. This is so gross, right? This is a regular expression inside a SQL query, inside a URL encoded URL up at the top. It works, so that's great. And using that regular expression, I can pull out a new column called pounds with her self-reported weight and her selfies. And so now I have a plugin that lets me do charting. So I can say, you know what, give me a line chart of her weight against time, and we can see Clio's weight over time based on her self-reported selfies on Twitter, which I think is, again, a killer application for this stuff. So super, super useful. This is a public demo, so you're welcome to play with this one. This is a data set of all 33,000 power plants in the world. And I can load all of those on a map, and that works because 33,000 points on a map is fine these days, apparently. And what's fun about this is I've got faceting enabled for things like the primary fuel. So if you want to see a map of every nuclear power plant in the world, you can click on nuclear, and here's a map of all of the world's nuclear plants. It shows me the countries that have them. So China has 12 nuclear plants. India has 9. So I'm going to click on India, and now this is a map of Indian nuclear power plants. And again, if I hit the JSON link, I've got that data out as JSON. So now I can build my own JavaScript application that does things with a map of nuclear power plants in India, should I want to do that. So let's write some SQL in our JavaScript. This is the dataset website. The dataset website is itself running on dataset. It's using custom templates, so it looks like a website. But all of this stuff is being served out of these databases. And I've got this plugin directory that shows you a list of plugins that you can install. And each plugin tells you how many times it was downloaded this week. That's kind of fun. And if we go to the secret URL dataset.io/content, I can see the database that is that runs this website. And there's a table in there called stats. So the stats table is basically, it's the number of downloads per day for all of my different packages. I'm going to facet by this again and dig into, let's do the dataset cluster map plugin. And so here we go. These are all of the downloads that I've had per day over the past, 257 days. And again, if I want to, I can do a quick line chart of like a date against a number of downloads and see that it's kind of spiky. But this is a relational database. It's public. Anyone can go here. Anyone can view and edit SQL. So I can do things like say, you know what, select just date and downloads from stats where package equals dataset cluster map and get back a list of download counts. So let's do this from JavaScript. There is this fantastic open source library I found called Sparkline, which is just a little JavaScript function that knows how to draw an SVG sparkline. And here it is. Let's switch the code. So this is their example code. And you can see you need an SVG element on the page, and then you do sparkline.sparkline and SVG, and you feed it an array of integers. And I've got a rand numbers function here. So every time I hit refresh, I get a different sparkline. But I want to do a sparkline of the download statistics for one of my packages. So bearing in mind what we've seen already, I can say, let's do what we're going to do. We'll do that dataset cluster map one here, and view and edit SQL. But I actually, because it's a sparkline, I just need the downloads number. So I can say select downloads from stats where package equals P0. and run that. Oh, I probably want to sort by date, don't I? Order by date. So here we have a list of numbers. I'm going to stick .json on the URL to get those back as JSON. That structure is not quite convenient, but we can add a shape. So I can say shape equals, I think array first will give me an array of those numbers. There we go. Look at this array. Wouldn't it be great if we could turn that into a spark line? So in my text editor, I'm going to do fetch that URL. Dot then, I was r.json, dot then, numbers, and then this thing here. And if I'm lucky,
no, numbers is misspelled still.
thank you. Did I get it? I think I got it. There it is. This is a sparkline of all of my, that's a sparkline of downloads of this thing over time, which I will probably drop onto the website at some point. So I've just prototyped up a brand new feature for my website entirely using, well, I say SQL and JavaScript. The SQL at the moment is encoded in the URL, but we can do better than that. We can say like var SQL equals backtick. Oomph, there's a SQL function. You'll notice this thing has an argument in it of P0. You know, let's do that to make it a bit prettier. Format document, order by package, order by date. And I'll get rid of that limit there as well. And then in this, instead of embedding the SQL query directly, I can do, I'll do that to format string 2. Encode URI component SQL, and if we refresh this page, it's broken. Now, what did I do wrong? I wonder what I did do wrong there. Oh, that's select SQL, select date downloads from stats where package equals p0 order by date. SQL equals encode URL component, and p0 equals that. This looks okay to me. Okay, let's retrieving the correct data. Oh, look at that. I'm getting back the dates and not the numbers because I wanted just downloads, didn't I? There we go. And we're back to having a sparkline. So nice. I'm going to jump ahead and show you the logical conclusion of this, which is, let's say that we want to do sparklines for all of our packages. So here's a SQL query that will give us exactly that. So we've got package, and then group concat in SQLite will group together by commas all of those values. So package group concat download this stats from stats group by package. This query is giving me all of the download numbers for all 88 of my packages, and it returns in 8.11 milliseconds. So I don't think we need to worry about performance on that. But again, if we stick .json in the URL, and I'm going to do shape equals array, I think. Here we go. Look at this. Package, table export, stats, big list of numbers, package stats, and so forth. So I won't type the code out directly, but this thing right here is running a SQL query that executes that exact query there, as stats, from stats, group by package, and then it fetches it, and then it loops through those packages, and for each one, creates an SVG element and calls the sparkline function, which means that we get back a page with all of my packages, each one with a sparkline. And this is cool. Like, looking at this, I'm like, oh, what happened there? How come HealthKit to SQLite had a little spike back in whenever that was? This is actually a super interesting piece of data visualization. And the implementation, as you can see, is basically nothing at all, right? It's a little bit of SQL, a couple of lines of JavaScript to fetch the shape, and then I'm looping through and calling the sparkline thing. So when is this a good idea? Well, firstly, obviously, this is a good idea for prototyping, right? Anytime you want, and I knocked this up, this demo up just this morning. It did not take me very much time at all. So if you want to prototype against interesting data, this is a great way to do it, I think. But I have no qualms at all about running this in production either. Like, I'm probably going to add these Spark lines to the dataset.io website, and the implementation for that's going to be what, 30. I think I've got Sparkline 2. This is that implementation of just the stats for a package. It's like 30 lines of code. It's pretty inconsequential, and it gives us this visualization, which is really useful. So anytime you've got, but the other thing that this tool set lets you is take any data that you like and turn it into something that you can stick online and start manipulating really quickly. Part of the dataset package, there's a command called dataset publish. And so the idea with this is you've got your data in a SQLite database. You can run dataset publish cloud run mydatabase.db or dataset publish Vercel. There are various other options like Heroku. And the command will package that data up with dataset and deploy it to that hosting service and start it up and running. And what's interesting here is if you look at these serverless hosting providers like Google Cloud Run and Vercel, the one limitation they have is that they don't let you have a database, because databases are expensive and difficult to scale and have to have backups and all of that. And part of the original idea for dataset was I was thinking about this, thinking, well, sure, I can't have a MySQL or Postgres, but if my data doesn't change, if it's just static data, like, I don't know, all of my dog swarm check-ins, and I only need to update it, say, once or twice a day, why not turn that into a binary file asset and bundle that in with the Docker container that I'm deploying? And that's essentially what dataset publish does. It takes whatever data you give it, sticks it as just another binary asset in the bundle of stuff that goes into the Docker container, and then deploys the entire thing. It deploys the data baked into the application code. And from a scaling point of view, this is kind of amazing, because, you know, if you get 1 million trip visitors at once, you just fire up a few thousand copies of that container, each with their own copy of the data, and you can handle traffic that way. And it's also incredibly cheap. The whole point of serverless providers like Cloud Run and Vercel is that they scale to 0 when they're not being used. So if you've got a dumb little toy project with some data that you want to stick online, you can publish it using this. And if nobody's visiting your dumb little toy, it'll cost you nothing. I've got so many of these things running that cost me like 3 to 5 cents a month because nobody's ever visiting them. But it means that I've got this excellent, I've got this constant opportunity for shipping crazy, interesting experiments. I'll show you another example of that. This is a website I've been building called Niche Museums, about my hobby of finding weird museums to go to. And it's got a use my location button, which shows me the nearest niche museum to me. It's the Comic Rockstars Toilet Seat Museum in Hayes Valley, which is brilliant. This guy runs a comic book shop and he gets famous comic artists to illustrate toilet seats for him. But this is actually just dataset. And again, I think if I go to /browse, I can look at the data under it. And that nearby query is a SQL query. It's select star, comma, have assigned distance between latitude and longitude as whatever. And so if I stick in latitude and longitude here, it will return those nearby museum. This is, again, a kind of crazy thing to be doing, right? Building entire features that are really just a SQL query that you've hooked up to an API. But it works. And so I can deploy these, I can knock out these little niche websites really quickly, build quite sophisticated functionality, and then serving them up is just a case of shipping off this little SQLite database file somewhere. 2 more demos. So I've got I have a script that pulls in all of my commits across all of my dataset projects into one database, just so I can analyze them in one place. And this is, I pulled this up because an obvious question if you're using SQL as an API is, well, why wouldn't you use GraphQL instead? And originally, my argument there was GraphQL is just SQL reinvented poorly, right? SQL has allowed us to pick exactly what data we need since the 1970s, and GraphQL comes along with this much more Byzantine syntax to achieve essentially the same thing. Why not just do the SQL trick that I've been doing? So to prove that I was right, I spent a couple of weeks building a GraphQL plugin for dataset, so dataset could speak GraphQL. And I came out the other end convinced that GraphQL is actually really cool, and it's not it is not, you can't just drop SQL in for GraphQL and stop thinking about it. So this is an example of that plugin. Here's a GraphQL query that's querying all of my commits, and for each commit, it's pulling back the author and the committer and the repository and so forth. And because GraphQL lets you, GraphQL, the big benefit of GraphQL is you've got this autocomplete stuff. You can say things like, give me the first 10 issues.
Can you make that font a little bit bigger?
Yes. Good, cool. So I'm going to say for each repository, I want the first 10 issues, and I want to know their title. And that comes back with a nested list of issues with the title for each one. Something that's the classic problem with GraphQL is that you get an n+1 SQL query problem, right? Where suddenly it's easy for somebody to accidentally trigger thousands of SQL queries and bring your server to its knees. An interesting thing about building on top of SQLite is that SQLite is a in-process database server. You don't have to make a network call for each of those queries. So there's this amazing article on the SQL website called Many Queries Are Fast. Where is it? Many queries. I
know the article you're talking about. This was making the rounds a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, many small queries are efficient in SQLite. SQLite is perfect for GraphQL. If you want to build a GraphQL API, building it up on SQLite means that the single biggest downside to GraphQL just disappears. So if you're more GraphQL inclined, you can use this toolkit and do the GraphQL thing instead. You can't, that Sparklines demo here, this is why SQL is more flexible than GraphQL. Right? GraphQL is pretty powerful, but it doesn't let you do quite this level of manipulation of your data. So that's a lightning tour of data sets, the various data set bits and pieces, and some of the crazy things you can do once you've got the ability to run SQL in your JavaScript. And I think we've got quite a bit of time for questions and discussion.
Amazing. Hey, thanks for that talk. That was really great. I love a talk that's 100% live coding. That's a bold move, no slides, just going to live code it. And even when you ran into the difficulty there, you still figured it out on the spot. So that's good. That's a brave man. I like the browse endpoint that you showed that's actually deployed on that Niche Museum's website. Like that actually lets you directly interact with it. That's so cool. I bet like hackers that are trolling the internet, trying to find vulnerable looking endpoints will probably stumble upon that and think that they've found a treasure trove because they see the SQL queries they can just type in and run, and then they're probably really disappointed when they realize that it's a read-only SQLite database.
I don't think I've had any bug bounty reports or anything like that yet, but that'll be a thing to look forward to. I'll show you something really fun. On all of these, you can just download the SQLite database. So if you want my SQLite database of weird little museums around the world, wget nichemuseums.com/browse.db, and it's yours, which is actually really it's great for like that thing where you've got a live environment and your dev environment and you need to synchronize the databases occasionally. I can do that with wget, which is really cool. I just wget the live database and start working on it locally. That's
super cool. So if you have questions for Simon, please post them in the chat. We'll go ahead and ask a few. But first off, before I start reading the questions from the audience, I have a question. I'm just kind of curious. So you mentioned you did the sort of journalism fellowship program, and you're into the sort of building tools to help journalists. Is this currently being used by any kind of like newspapers or any journalists? And how are they using it?
So I found out, what day is it? I found out yesterday that ProPublica, which is a very, very fine news organization, run dataset internally for all sorts of things. Like the goal, my dream with this software is newsrooms get to run a private version of this. They upload their CSV data from their reports into it and so forth, and then they use it to find stories. And I just found out that ProPublica have actually been doing that for quite a while, and there are stories that they've published which started off as a CSV file that they loaded into this tool that people around the newsroom dug through, and then somebody found something that looked a bit weird, and they did real reporting around it. So it's beginning to happen, which is super exciting to me. And I do this thing on Fridays. I let people book 25-minute office hours sessions with me to talk about the project, basically as a way to get people who are using it to tell me what they're doing. I've had quite a few conversations now with people in newsrooms who are either using it or are trying to get it running for what they're doing. And that's thrilling. Like, the whole point of this project is I want to help newspapers publish the data behind their queries and analyze that data and do journalism against it. And after 3 years of pushing, it feels like it's finally beginning to take hold a bit.
Mm-hmm. It's super cool. Yeah, and then, I mean, when they're done with the exploration, I mean, has any journalist actually published like an article where there's some kind of a visualization or an interactive chart or something that's using that's being backed by data set?
This is the best example so far. The Baltimore Sun published public salary records for all government employees in the state of Baltimore, and this is pure data set with they did custom CSS and a custom template, but this right here is data set. Which is amazing. And I see these, I'm hoping to see a lot more of this, because this is definitely one of the goals of the tool, is to make building these kinds of interface, the sort of like custom search and explore database things, as easy as possible. And I build a lot of these myself. Like there's this thing called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, where if you are a lobbyist or spy in the United States, you have to register with the Department of Justice. I think mainly so that if you're a spy and they catch you, they've got yet another thing that they can bust you for. But it turns out they publish all of the data as CSV files. It goes back to 1943 when they were using this to keep track of Nazis. So I've got a data set that I run which is exactly that. And so if you want to search for Paul Manafort, you can find all of the instances where Paul Manafort registered as a lobbyist for some foreign government. And that's crazy cool. And yeah, the idea with this is journalists should, like, making this data, making it actionable. Like, giving a journalist a 300 megabyte CSV file is not particularly useful. If you give them a simple interface for searching that CSV file and then maybe doing like maybe joining against other data and so on, that's when it starts turning into something you can get news out of. So yeah, that's the sort of beyond figuring out my dog's favorite bakery. That's the goal of the project.
Right. So I got to ask one more question, then I'll go to the audience questions. How do you think that this compares to something like an interactive notebook in terms of ease of use for somebody who's non-technical, like maybe a journalist who doesn't know how to write code in a notebook? Is it really is it easier for them to figure out the SQL queries and to figure out the interface in there?
That's where stuff like so journalists. I don't expect journalists to know SQL. But giving them a page with a box in that they can type in works really well. The other thing is that this table view here, you're able to do a lot here. Like, you can sort by columns and filter by just, you can say filter things where registrant name contains Simon. And actually, what you're doing there is you're building a SQL query. But it's that sort of classic query builder interface. You don't necessarily have to understand that. You can always upgrade to SQL by clicking this button. So if you know what you're doing, or actually I'm beginning to hear from people who are learning SQL using this tool, which is thrilling. Like, I love the idea that people, like that this becomes a learning tool to help journalists and people start learning more about SQL. But yeah, so the idea is you don't need to know any SQL tool to start using it, but the SQL is available there as the sort of like experts interface. The other thing that's really cool is you can bookmark SQL queries and you can put these parameters in them. So if I send you this link, you can pretty much ignore, in fact, I can hide the SQL and then send you the link. And so all you have to know is that you can type like Tom in there and run that query. And so really what this is a custom application that I've just built for you by entering some SQL and bookmarking it. And that, I think, is really interesting, this idea of an application that exists solely as a bookmark, but gives people that interaction to start working with it. I've been fleshing that out with plugins. I built a plugin where if one of the parameters ends in the word free draw, then it draws you a map with a JavaScript widget for drawing shapes on. So this is a bookmark where I can draw a circle around San Francisco and then run the search. And this is doing a geospatial polygon intersection where it's looking for everything that intersects with my polygon and that has the word mini in the name of the park. So it's a search engine for mini parks in San Francisco and Oakland based on drawing shapes, which is awesome. Like, this is really
awesome.
And it's just a plugin. It's a JavaScript plugin that says if thing is called free draw, add a leaflet map, and hook it up so that when you draw a shape on it, it populates the GeoJSON into the field. And that's all it's doing. But again, it's a bookmarkable custom application for finding mini parks, which, yeah, that I love. And I love the idea that I find that in newsrooms, there's always one nerd, right? There's one journalist who's good with CSV files and so on, and they spend their entire time fielding requests from the other journalists saying, hey, do you have the latest unemployment figures or whatever? And I keep on having conversations with those people where they're starting to think, okay, if I spin up a data set, I can do this self-service. I can say, go to the data set and look for, search on the front page for like unemployment numbers and click the link, and you can get the data yourself that way. And so I think that's going to be a really powerful way I can help out in newsrooms, is by building that.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's take a question from the audience. So Tiny Fluff asks, could you use SQLite in the browser on the client side and then read the SQLite database file over the network using range requests over HTTP?
So I don't think the range requests thing would work, unfortunately. That's the one limitation, is that SQLite, you need the entire file in order to do things, which is a real shame, because I have done an observable notebook that does exactly that. So there's SQL.js. I thought I had one of these. Grid.js. Oh, it was, no. I took one of Mike Bostock's things and modified it, because, yeah, SQL.js does have the ability to fetch a SQLite binary file over the network. And so you can, like with my museums example, you could absolutely like run SQL.js and load the browse.db file. That was the bug fix I did, is I added cause headers to the binary file so that you could fetch it using SQL.js from somewhere else. So that totally works. But you need to load the whole thing into memory, which is a bit of a shame. So yeah, part of the philosophy around this is, if you can SQL back to the server, then you can take like a gigabyte-sized database and just pull back 5 kilobytes of data that you need for whatever it is you're doing.
Right. That's interesting, yeah. I've been doing a lot of playing around with the browser file system APIs, and I wonder if there's some way to do it where it's at least not in memory. Like you could use the new one in Chrome, the new file system access API.
Wow.
And you can sort of, it gives you kind of like a low-level file reader interface.
That would be amazing, yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to that after. But interesting. So let's see. Let's take another question. So let's see. Actually, you know what? This is kind of related. This person's asking, who is it? It's Shizarun is asking, can you run dataset SQL to integrate with Elasticsearch Query API? And more generally, can you basically, is it tied to SQLite, or can you back it with any kind of SQL database?
Well, right now it's completely tied to SQLite, because I've written database abstraction layers in the past, and they like slow you down a lot. So I figured, set SQLite only, and then I don't have to think about it. I'm more and more coming around to the idea that I want to get it to work against Postgres as well, because Postgres is bloody amazing, but also if I work against Postgres, I can work against data warehouses, because there's data warehouse software that speaks the Postgres SQL dialect. So if I do that, and it's looking more likely I will, it'll be plugin based. So you could write plugins to get it to talk to other databases. At the same time, Elasticsearch, actually no, Elasticsearch has SQL these days, I think. So you totally could plug it into Elasticsearch via that. That would be kind of cool. The other thing that's sort of fun is it's very easy to write custom SQL functions in Python that work in SQLite. So dataset jellyfish is a good example of that. So I've got a plugin hook that you can use to add new SQL functions to dataset. Like here's a plugin I wrote which adds a soundex function, so you can like do soundex analysis of different strings. But I did play with a SQL function that actually did outbound HTTP requests to another API, which is a terrible idea, but it worked. It even works in joins, so I could do a join which would result in 100 outbound API requests. And the idea with that was to be able to do something like query Elasticsearch as a SQL function, bring back data, and then join the search results against the primary keys in the SQLite database, and do things that way. So there are some really hairy things you could do along those lines that would work.
So another question is anybody doing things with merging distributed updates to shared data sets? So we have a lot of people. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so this is distributed databases is a really interesting area. There are a whole bunch of SQLite adjacent projects, which I'm keeping an eye on, things like RQLite and DQLite. And there's this amazing new thing called Lightstream, which has been going around recently, which is a SQLite replication mechanism where you basically run a process that watches your SQLite database, and any new rows, it publishes them to an Amazon S3 bucket that other things can replicate down from. And it costs about $3 a month for a actively maintained database. And of course, you can have as many replicas as you like reading off the same S3 bucket, and you get point-in-time recovery, which is phenomenal. But actually merging databases is really hard because of primary key conflicts and so on. If you're disciplined and do things like every row having a UUID, then you can sort of hack it together. But to be honest, I feel like there are dedicated projects doing that outside of the realm of SQLite and dataset that have a much better chance of succeeding.
Mm-hmm. So a follow-up question to the earlier question from Tiny Fluff. They're wondering, is the thing you mentioned about needing to have the whole database in memory when you load it in the client side, is that a limitation of SQLite? Does it literally need to memory map the file?
Nope, it's SQLite.js. SQLite is designed to run on, SQLite runs on my watch to count my steps, and it's on phones and laptops. And SQLite, with very few resources, will happily crunch through a gigabyte of database on disk. It's one of the reasons I love building on top of SQLite is it is designed to run on so many devices and in such tight resource constraints. If you give it a web server to run on it can do pretty much anything. But yeah, I've worked with SQLite databases that are 10 gigabytes in size, and that's worked fine. I tried a 100 gigabyte one once, and it was a bit creaky. The technical size limit on SQLite was 1.4 terabytes, but they bumped it up to 2.4 terabytes in the most recent release because a customer asked them to do that. So somewhere in the world, there is a SQLite database that's bigger than 1.5 terabytes. I don't know where. So yeah, it's a very, very impressive piece of database software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm always amazed at what people are using SQLite for when I hear about it. So one thought I was having just about the security angle again is I always think about the security angle of things. You mentioned you open it in read-only mode, which I'm guessing that's a feature of SQLite that enforces that you can only read. But I know that a lot of SQL or a lot of databases, rather, they have these SQL dialects. They're not exactly the standard SQL, but they support sort of undocumented features. You can select random column names that are not really real columns, that are sort of almost like environment variables or things that are provided by the system. How worried are you about there being some kind of poorly documented feature in SQLite that lets you, I don't know, let's say read arbitrary files on the file system, or have you looked into sort of the undocumented features?
So SQLite I'm not afraid of because it's one of the tightest written pieces of software on earth, right? The test suite's amazing. The documentation is really comprehensive. They have a section of the documentation that says, if you are doing the crazy thing that I'm doing, here's how to do it safely. So that's fine. Spatialite scares me. So that demo I showed you earlier with where you could draw a circle on a map, that's using a SQLite extension called Spatialite, and Spatialite is a vast quantity of C and C++ code maintained mainly by one developer. So that makes me a lot more nervous. The thing that makes me not nervous is I run these things in Docker containers on Cloud Run. And so the worst that will happen if you exploit Spatialite on Cloud Run in some way is you'll crash my container, it'll restart again. But I'd be very cautious running Spatialite like this on a system where you can't afford to have the whole thing just blow up. I'm also excited about Postgres because I was just looking this morning at Postgres's read-only stuff. And of course, Postgres's permission system is rock solid, right? This thing has been tested through. So if I can get dataset running on Postgres, where you create a Postgres user that only has select permissions on certain tables, Postgres has robust connection timeouts. It's got all of that kind of stuff. I'm very confident that will work. The other thing that's exciting is like one of the obvious complaints about this is what you can let people write SQL against your tables. What if you change your table schema, right? Everything's going to go to hell. So what I'd suggest there is don't expose the tables, expose views. Right? If I create a SQL view that's essentially a subset of my overall tables that I know is stable, and I give your Postgres user permission to select just against that view, you can go to town on it. And if I change my schema, I just have to change the view definition so that my changes won't break you. And I think that's going to work really well. I've not tried it yet. It's an idea I'm pretty confident in as a way of insulating against those schema changes. Super cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So do you have any good tricks for like where to get these interesting data sets? Like, you mentioned the museum one, and of course you can use your Twitter data, but I'm guessing you had to write some kind of script to pull that out of the Twitter API and put it into SQLite. How do you like? Yeah, so there is plugins on the website and then tools, and tools answers that other question. How do you get your data into SQLite in the first place? So I've got a Python library and CLI tool called SQLite Utils, which lets you, oh, that page is broken. That's interesting. This tool lets you write Python code to ingest JSON into SQLite, and also lets you use the command line. So you can like curl a URL, pipe it into SQLite Utils insert, and it'll turn that JSON into a database. And then I've used that as the basis for writing lots of other tools. So I've got this entire family of tools called Dogsheep, which is my set of tools for personal analytics. So I showed you my dog's tweets earlier. Those are loaded in using a tool I built called Twitter to SQLite, which hits the Twitter API and saves your tweets into a SQLite database. I've got GitHub to SQLite, pulls in your commit history and so forth. I've got one tool, this is fun, Genome to SQLite, imports your genome from 23andMe and loads that into a database, which means that you can do your own, I think this is it. So I've got a SQL query that tells me what color my eyes are based on my exported data from 23andMe. My eyes are blue. So cool. 99% of the time. Yep, this is it. This is it. Oh, okay, got it. This is a live SQL query that tells me what color my eyes are. It took me a weekend to figure this out. I had to recruit several scientists at Science Hack Day because I don't know anything about genetics. But yeah, so there's an entire, and I keep on knocking out new ones of these tools because, like, I just built Evernote to SQLite to get my Evernote notes into a state where I can start using them. Airtable export will export your Airtable data into SQLite. Because yeah, like you said, if you're going to use this tooling, the number one problem is, okay, how do I get data into it in the first place? And then once you've got, like I've got CSVs to SQLite and so on, there are so many interesting sources of CSV data out there. One of my favorites, the New York Open Data Portal has a thing called the Squirrel Park Census, which where a bunch of volunteers did a census of all of the squirrels in Central Park. Here we go. And you can get that data. So if you want a CSV file of all of the squirrels in Central Park, that is a thing which is available to you. And I've actually, I've loaded that into dataset. I think if I search my blog for squirrels, I should find it. So I have a dataset copy of, my computer's got really unhappy. Census, there we go. Here we go. This is a dataset instance with all of Central Park squirrels on a map, and you can facet by primary fur color. So if you just want to see the, oh, the map's not working. That's a shame. But yeah, here we go. So these are the 392 cinnamon squirrels that were spotted in Central Park. So that's great. I actually put a call out on Twitter this morning for, has anyone got any entertaining data sets like the squirrel census one? And they got a lead on a data set of dead manatees in Florida dating back to 1976. So if that rocks your boat, if you want to see some dead manatee recordings, those are available on here. Here we go. The manatee carcass recovery locations data set. So yeah, the world is full of interesting data, and it's so much fun building tools to let you easily import that data and start manipulating and doing fun stuff with it. Here we go. Here's our manatee carcass recovery.
Oh, here we go. That makes sense. All on the coast. Why is there that line in the middle of Florida? Is that like a river?
Yeah, I think there's a river that crosses Florida that has, oh, but it has manatees in the river. Oh, look at this lake. Lake Okeechobee has a bunch. Yeah, that's really fascinating. That's the thing about this stuff, is so many things just jump out at you if you do something as dumb as just plot all the points on a map. Every time I do any of these demos, I learn something new and curious about the world. But yeah, I'm super intrigued by all of these dead manatees now.
Totally. Yeah, that's interesting. No, I'm going to definitely give this a shot now after this. I think that's super cool. I think now that you mentioned all those different exporters you've made now, like getting data into SQLite doesn't seem so burdensome. And you know, and then having something that's like really nice and point and click to play around with the data sounds really, really cool. And you don't have to worry about API rate limits when you're operating on your own SQLite database. So that's amazing. You know,
to be honest, like API SQLite is so damn fast. Like most of my queries return in 10 milliseconds. Even when I'm sharing data publicly, I'm not really bothering about API limits. I'm noticing API limits are less common than they used to be. Like I keep on coming across APIs, big public APIs that just don't bother, which is cool. I guess computers are fast now, and if you're doing cheap API queries, it's like you wouldn't put a rate limit on your actual website. So why do one on your API?
Well, yeah, the other thing that's bad about putting rate limits on your API is that you actually incentivize scrapers to use the website. If you're not rate limiting the website, but you're limiting the API, then you're actually going to be incentivizing people to be scraping the more.
I have been that scraper several times.
Right. Cool. I think we're out of time for more questions, but this has been great, Simon. Thanks for coming and sharing that with us. Dataset's a super cool project. I like that you figured out a way to make you know, to do SQL on the client side that's not completely crazy and dangerous. And you know, the title was a bit clickbaity. It pulled me in, and then but it didn't disappoint. So
Sure. Well, cool. Thanks a lot. This has been really fun. And yeah, I'll be hanging out in the after party in a moment.
Nice. That's great. Yeah. So let's mention how that works for people. If it's your first time to Speakeasy, we do an after party afterwards, and we hang out and we hang out and socialize. So it's like a real life meetup. Remember those when we used to have those? So we're going to go over to this URL here, speakeasy.co/JS, and we'll be there for the next 20 minutes hanging out and catching up with each other. And you can ask Simon your questions if you get paired with him for a 5-minute chat. Cool. So we'll go over there in a sec. Thanks again, Simon. And if people want to check out the project, what's the best URL? Just the GitHub page?
No, it's dataset.io is the place to go. It's spelt like the word cassette, but with a D on the beginning. It's actually the Commodore 64 tape drive was called the dataset. And I thought it was a unique name that would help me search for things. But it turns out the Commodore 64 retro community are very, very noisy. So that most of the conversation on the internet is about the Commodore 64 tape drive.
Got it. Cool. I put the URL on the screen there so people can just go directly to it. Cool. Thanks again, Simon. Everybody catch you over there at the social happy hour.